So just to give you the heads up, there is a chance that we won't meet on Wednesday next week. We might have to move it at some other day. I will let you know whenever I know. Excellent. So just to give you the heads up, there is a chance that that's cool. Yeah, I don't like to listen to my own voice. I don't sound like I'm supposed to. All right, where we are. So we're continuing today the discussion about conditional and unconditional quantile regressions. So the main question for you is, what do you read? Which paper? Which one you wanna tell me about?
I forgot. I failed to for today.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will put that on your record cards.
But yeah, I'm okay.
No, that will come back to bite you as part of homework then.
Yeah.
At some point. Anyways, so the whole discussion that we did last 2 weeks ago was about why would we care about conditional quantile regressions and how do we estimate them? And at the end of the day, what we said is that quantile regressions allow you to capture relationships outside of the mean because they're trying to capture how a particular quantile or what's the relationship of quantiles once you condition a certain characteristic. So in other words, is if you keep x fixed, what is the relationship of all the quantiles or the distribution that are based on that x? In the plot that I was providing you before was this is the plot and this is the distribution over for different quantiles. Let's say that this is for the 90th, this is for the 10th, and this is for the 50th. What this condition is trying to say is once you condition on x, you know that this is the 19th quantile, once you condition on this other x, you know that this is the other quantile, this other x is another quantile, is what is the function that relates all these points together. We actually did something very similar for the conditional mean, because we said that at the end of the day, what we are trying to do is figure out how to model the conditional mean, meaning once you create all the, you identify all the possible combination of x's, calculate the means, you're trying to create a model that explains those conditional means for all the possible x's that you have new data. But then we say that the problem with this particular type of analysis is that they're going to give you something that is very specific to the person. In other words, whenever you want to estimate what's the impact of these individuals, you need to know their outcome. You need to know in which part of the distribution are, and then you can say something about what will happen to them if there is a change in x's. That only works, of course, under the rank invariance assumption, which means if you were born in a high state, you always relate in a high state. If you were born in a lower state, you always relate in a lower state. But that's very difficult to say strongly. It is possible that when this person goes up, he might go up a little bit, but not as much, because those unobservables might not move or might not keep in the same state that he was before. Again, if he was up, might actually go down, perhaps increase. This is what is called the rank similarity, because it tends to be at least higher up than most people or than some people, never really going down as much. And this is more realistic in the sense of this is what might actually happen if people change their characteristics. Once they move to the next group, they're not going to be necessarily at the top, but they're probably going to remain high up there. That was the rank similarity assumption. Then you just say there is no rank preservation, so very good with an NRP, no rank preservation, which is what if you were here and something happens to you, you might move downstairs or all the way up, you do not know. So in that situation, this interpretation that that this person will move here is no longer valid. Therefore, we stop talking about what happens to individuals, we just talk about what happens to distributions. So I don't care if this person ends up here or that this person ends up here. I just care that these 2 points are the ones that I'm going to compare because these are 2 different individuals, yes, but are in the same rank to be compared. So I can compare what happened with 90th percentile here with the 19th percentile here.
So it's rank invariance, rank
Similarity,
similarity.
and just no rank preservation, so you can move whatever.
Okay.
And all of this is because the ranking, all of these cases, is that all the rankings that are related to the taus are going to be a function of that unobservable, but that unobservable, because it could be a function of so many factors, not only things that you're capturing on the, that you're not able to capture, but things that you're just not able to control for. So I want to, perhaps that's something important to consider here. When we consider this type of modeling, this set of unobservables is going to be composed from the truly unobservables, so factors you cannot control, you do not know what are they really trying to measure. So things like, I don't know, skill that really you cannot measure, or their intelligence, and I'm not talking IQ, but what's their capacity, things that you cannot measure, and things that you just didn't include in the model because you didn't have it in data. These things for sure are going to remain fixed. If you have, I don't know, you suddenly increase your level of education, but for some reason I do not control for your gender is not going to change. So in that regard, this ranking variance might make sense because there are some factors that are just in control for, but they are still fixed there, or I believe them to be fixed. But what about these? If these are truly unobservables, they could just be random lag that every time that you do something, it affects your characteristics. So because of that, is that ranking variance is very strong to say. It makes interpretation easy, but it's very strong to really say that it's going to be true in the data. Rank similarity might be the more realistic because of this dichotomy on the errors, things that are truly random and things that are just not controlled for. And non-rank preservation, which is this is just confronted by things that you cannot measure and always run. So it's another extreme, but might be true. So because of that is that again you compare conditional distributions, you set up an X, you forget about trying to say anything about a person, you talk about groups, how the group is moving. Is the distribution increasing, decreasing, or what is going on? Then we're talking about the second thing that we start to talk about is what if I'm not interested on conditional quantiles, but I'm really interested on talking about what happens with the unconditional quantile, meaning I don't care so much about these little distributions. I really care about what is going on with the distribution, with the overall distribution of Y. So why are you interested in things like this? Well, if you're going to microeconomy, even macroeconomy, you're going to be interested in things like poverty, inequality, no, same word for us. Just a different word, poverty, inequality, distribution, or some kind of analysis. So you're trying to see what happens with the outcome that before was here, but suddenly, because of a policy, moves like this. I want to be able to identify this, or at least the potential movements of my distribution on this regard. And second, I want to measure what does this movement from here to here, what does this imply for the conditional quantiles? When you go from Q to Q prime, or from distribution 1 to distribution 2. Of course, we do not need to concentrate only on quantiles. We can think about any other statistic of interest. Gini's, tail index, poverty index, etc., etc. Now, how do we do that? The two options that we discussed, well, all of the discussion was based on, let me see, on this general formula. So whenever you make any statistic of interest in the conditional sense, you know that that statistic of interest is going to depend. Let me move a little bit earlier. Here. It's going to depend on how the statistic is constructed, the function h, and how many times you see the data happening in your sampling data set in the population. So this will tell you how you identify the poor. This is going to tell you how do you count how many poor there are. It's going to tell you how do you measure the distance to the mean, which is the square distance to the mean, which is a small component of the variance. It's going to tell you how many people are X number above the variance or above the mean, or X number below the mean. How much variation there is in the data. So what we said is that based on that distribution and making or acknowledging that all data is going to be jointly distributed, it is possible to introduce characteristics to this kind of estimation of the unconditional distribution. We just say that f of y can be substituted by saying f of y is just the integration of all the conditional distributions of x. Now, this conditional distribution is what is going to bring us back to analyzing conditional quantiles as a method to estimate unconditional effects. So at the end of the day, our statistic, our unconditional statistic could change. Well, let me change not more like this, but perhaps. Well, this was I was doing it for the particular case of the mean. I think I have here. For any general characteristic, it can be a function of how do you determine a particular element of the distribution, or how a particular observation affects the contribution, the construction of the statistic, how frequently we see that whenever we fix characteristics x, and how x is distributed. So based on this, we say there are at least 3 ways to determine how to analyze the impact of a change in x on the unconditional distribution of y. The first one is we modify f of x directly, either by simulation or by reweighting. The first one I talked to you was, let's reweight that. Let's find those weight functions that are going to make this distribution of x look more like the distribution that I really want to analyze the impact of, which is g of x. So I need to create these weights, and these weights were estimated using a propensity score. The other option was to, if I don't want to estimate this, because it might be less intuitive, I can estimate all of these guys. In other words, estimate all the possible conditional relationships of y with respect to x as complex as possible, and then just make a simple simulation of x. Meaning, specifically, go to the data, modify the x, and see what happens through the conditional distribution in the outcome. Now, what I said here was that this function f of x can be, you just need to make this distribution of f of x as flexible as possible. Meaning, I could assume, for example, that this f of y respect to x has a normal distribution where the expected value of y respect to x is a linear combination of x and betas, and the variance of y respect to x, well, more specifically the log of variance, just to make things a little bit more scalable, is a combination of x and gammas. So by doing this, I'm estimating a flexible representation of the conditional distribution. That doesn't need to be the same for, you don't need to do the second part, but they just make it more flexible. Why? If I only had this component, I could still make a simulation of the data. Let's say that they would have a very strict components of the simulation, because the only thing that is changing the characteristics is the linear combination and only a single data. But by allowing these other components to play into the data, I'm saying it's not only the mean that's going to change, but also the scales that could change. So I'm going to account for more information when making simulation of the data. So it will much better approximate to this conditional distribution, which is at the end what we want to do. Because I don't want to estimate f of x, it might be difficult for some reason. I want to approximate f of y given x as closely as possible, which means I need to estimate these two components as flexible as possible, or instead of that, estimate these as flexible as possible, because with this, we're also approximating this conditional distribution. So those are the two methods that I mentioned before. Reweighting, where you just need to capture the weights, and the weights to largely transform what you observe, f of x, into what you want to get the data as g of x.
In your paper, you mentioned that this one is not very practical.
Actually, I said that this is the most practical compared to the other one, because here you only need to estimate one model. This. You just need to estimate the conditional probability. You just need to estimate this guy. The part that makes it not practical is that every time that you want to make a different kind of policy, so you create a policy about wages education going up, you need to create a model. You want to make a policy of unions increasing, you need to make another model that will capture that policy. If you want to make something like people are aging, you need to create a different model that will capture that particular set of characteristics. The other problem that this particular modeling has is that it's really good whenever your policies will change characteristics, but the characteristics will still be within the support of the data. And what do I mean with this? So let's say, and Sean, let me know if you can see what I'm going to draw over here. Let's say that we have a distribution of x, and this is the original distribution of x. This is what we observe. Now, if I simulate something that changes the distribution to become something like this, you're perfectly fine, because this smaller distribution is supported by the original. You're going to find everybody here in the other one. However, you won't be able to make a simulation that transforms your data like this, because x's before were only available until here, and therefore this segment of your policy will not be able to be captured by using reweighting. You literally will miss this part of the information, so you cannot say anything about what we're talking with these guys. Another way of thinking about it is that there is nobody on the original sample that could be used to say something about these guys. You can say everything about these guys, because you still find at least one person with the same characteristics, but there will be nobody with these characteristics in the original data. Therefore, you cannot use reweighting to analyze a policy that does that kind of analysis, or that make that kind of simulation in your data. All right, so the other approach was modeling the conditional distribution. You need to do it as flexible as possible. You have a couple of options, at least two options that I'm suggesting here, but at least a few more. You can make the model more realistic based on your characteristics. Instead of using a normal distribution, you can use a Poisson, chi-square, depending on the data that you have. Instead of quantile regression, there are also the distributional regressions that do something similar like quantiles, but look at the ranking rather than the actual quantile, and you can use that to make your analysis. So in this case, I simply estimate the model with a very flexible, I try to model the data with a very flexible model. Once I have the model, I simulate the data. Once I simulate the data, I can compare the results. And that gives me something like what I have in examples 1 and 2, which I think I didn't include the histogram. But if you look at what was going on, they actually give you results that are very similar, or that were very similar. What happens with my particular policy, which in this case was the increase on fines, because I was constraining that increase of fines on my policy, so it doesn't matter how things are changing, I was constraining those changes, so there is always support in the data. That's why for anybody that has fines equals to 12, nothing will happen to them. So in the new environment, in the new world, there's still going to be at least some, or the maximum fines that you can observe is 12, because that's what you see in the regional data as well. So you have somebody to compare it to and to make the appropriate distributions. And after making some simulations, I find that the results were actually consistent with the previous approaches, at least with the previous approaches I had, that the impact on fines is larger for the upper quantiles, much lower at the lower end. So who is going to be affected by increasing the fines? Probably the ones who are more likely to do this kind of to have a DUI, because now the cost of having one of them is going to be much higher, so they have to reduce that number. However, at the lower end, they're already doing not much, so it makes sense that there's going to be not much compression when there is there is already a very low level of infractions in the lower end of the distribution. When I did that using quantile regressions, the same thing. Here, the main differences were that I was comparing not only my original data to my simulated data, but also to the simulated with the policy. The main reason for doing that is that I can use these two to estimate the effect and these two to validate my model. The closer this is to this, and not only to this point, but to the whole distribution, the better my model is. If these are too different, then I probably need to modify my specification so I can re-estimate, I have a better prediction of these that would allow me to have a better prediction of the policy. The problem with both of them, again, is that well, in the first case, I do not have support of my policy, I cannot use reweighting. In the second case, if you want to do any kind of standard errors, you need to bootstrap a lot. Because you need to do this, at least for this version of quantile regression that I'm presenting, you need to do the bootstrap for all the 99 regressions for all the possible quantiles. Technically speaking, you should be able to do that even for more quantiles, you have more data. You need to bootstrap the whole process a few times, and with a few times, I say at least 100 times at the minimum, considering the complexity of the model. And then is that you'll be able to estimate some idea of the standard errors of the models to see if your estimations are robust or not. In the first case, because there is only one model that needs to be estimated, the logic, even though it has some limitations, it's much easier to deal with. Because in your bootstrap, you just need to estimate one model, and then just estimate the statistical interest. That's it. These two, however, as I said, has some limitations. Both of them are going to be limited to a single policy. In the case of the quantile, you can simulate all the policies at once, meaning you do not need to re-estimate the quantile regression every time. You can have just one set of quantile regressions and already save it, and then just simulate any kind of policy that you have in mind to see what happens afterwards. You can see that here, for example, I could just estimate this once, all the 100 regressions, and then make different changes on my policies to make the predictions. It is entirely possible. I can just say all the coefficients, and it will be relatively easy to modify any policy that I wanted once I have the quantile regression estimate, which is the longest component here. For the first case, however, when you're estimating probabilities, the policy itself is going to affect the probability model, because the probability model depends on all the characteristics, and if these characteristics change, then you have to estimate the probability model. So every time that you change your policy, you have to estimate your logit or your probability or whatever model you're using to identify the probability of in one group versus the other. And that limits the usefulness of this, because if you have more than one policy, then you need to estimate everything again. Again, the weighting is very simple. It's only one model, but has the other limitation that you need to have support on the data. Otherwise, you cannot appropriately use the weighting. Modeling conditional distribution is more direct approach, but it's computationally more intense. You need to really get a lot of model running, especially if you are interested in standard errors. So as a third alternative is that instead of looking at f of x as what the first model does, or f of y with respect to x as the second approach does, what grid progressions tells you is just look into the statistic itself. So we're going to see how this changes when any of these ones do change. Okay, so this first approach was introduced by Pirpo, Fortini, and Review in 2009. His working paper has been around at least since 2007. I first encountered the paper, I think, 2010 or 11, when I was trying to work it on my thesis. And is, compared to these other alternatives, a computationally simpler approach to estimate unconditional effects based on almost any policy that you might think, with a caveat, which we can explore, that that particular policy has to be of a very specific kind. This strategy, as presented by Pirpo, Fortini, and Review, concentrated mostly on the estimations on impacts, on unconditional impacts on the unconditional quantile. So you read the paper named Unconditional Quantile Regressions, focus mostly on trying to figure out how to identify these relationships, how the unconditional quantile will change when excess of the characteristics of the individuals change. Later, this is strategy, and I want to say later, but in fact, okay, so there have been at least 3 or 4 papers later that have tried to expand the analysis that was proposed for them and expand into other statistics. Among those, yes, a little bit of self-promotion. I wrote a small paper where I tried to explain why it works and allowing to the user, when anyone wants to try it, the use of these kind of strategies for almost any statistic for which you can identify the risk. This central inference function, which I'm going to tell you in a second what exactly it is. But I want to say this, even though this is, I'm saying this has been done later. Actually, there were papers before people and Review that already discovered, already exploited some of these characteristics of the inference functions. And I'm going to tell you why is that this, well, I will tell you why this is not as new as how it was presented, but the particular usage of this as a regression analysis was originally presented by Pirpo, Fortini, and Review in 2009. So in contrast with other approaches, because this statistic focuses on analyzing what happens to the statistic of interest in particular, is that you can apply it to make any kind of policy that changes of f of x, or at the extreme, policies that changes f y of x. The only difference, and perhaps what will make it different from the other approaches, is that every time that you change your statistic of interest, is that you need to re-estimate your model. Because this component over here is statistic specific. The other big advantage of this approach is that For most statistics, you can take the standard error from your model, and those standard errors are the ones that are going to tell you everything that you need to know in terms of the statistical inference. Meaning you don't need to do almost anything to those standard errors to be corrected, except for the cases of the quantiles. Every time that you have a quantile involved, there are a couple of other factors that need to be accounted for. And unfortunately, as far as I know, there is no easy solution for them. So let's start with the basics to understand how exactly is that drift regression works. So let's reconsider the original question. The original question is, how do you capture the impact of a changes in the distribution of characteristics or the distribution of the outcome on a change on a particular statistic of interest? What you do is, once you have your G of Y, meaning what happened with the distribution of characteristics after a call is implemented, and you compare it to what was before, you just need to estimate the statistic for those two states, and that's what gives you the actual change in the statistic. So there's really no mystery there. You have the data for both scenarios, you just estimate for both, you capture the difference, and that's your result. But now let's make a specific assumption on how exactly this G of Y is going to change. So let's assume that this G of Y is something that is just a contamination of it. What do I mean a contamination of it? First, consider this formula where this error epsilon is 0. If it's equal exactly to 0, then G of Y is going to be exactly the same as F of Y. But now let's introduce a little bit of a contamination. A contamination in the sense of, let's say to this population, I introduce a new person on the sample. Because I introduce a new person on the sample, the distribution is going to change marginally, but it's going to change. How is it going to change? For 99% of the population, or 99% of the data, will still be distributed as an F of Y, because nothing has changed for them. But for 1% of the data, there is going to be a change because your cumulative distribution for that particular person is just a jump. So this is what I'm calling the contamination. This is your original distribution. Now I'm mixing these two. And depending on how much the distributions are mixed, what happens is, before this point, the distribution now moves a little bit. Here is that we have a jump. The size of the jump is going to depend on the epsilon. The larger the epsilon, the larger the jump over here, and then continues. So this small jump over here is a contamination that is being brought because I'm adding a person to this. Okay. So now we have a very specific change on the distribution. F of Y is our original data. G of Y is what happens to that distribution when I add one person with income equal to YI. So if I now apply this over here, what exactly this delta V is going to measure? It's going to measure how my statistic of interest is going to change because of this additional person. Now, you might say, or you might think that this change is going to be extremely small. Imagine a population of a million individuals, if I drop only one person. The change on the overall distribution, there is going to be a change, but it's going to be minimal. So in order to make that minimal change make sense, we need to rescale it. And we're going to rescale it based on how big is that change that we introduce into the sample. And this is how we have the influence function. So the influence function is nothing else than the change that you expect to observe on the statistic when there is an additional person dropped on the sample, but you scale it by how large is the change on the distribution. and the change of the distribution is going to be equal to epsilon. Now, something else to consider here is that if you consider this idea of the delta on the statistic, is that the change on the statistic is going to be equal to the influence function times how big the change in the distribution is. Okay, so this is the key for the analysis of risk relations. The influence functions are defined over here. Does it remind you of anything else? It's a derivative. It's actually called, well, there are a couple of main terms. One is the Gattell derivative, and the other one is the Ham-Hale, if I remember correctly, derivative, or just in general, a functional derivative. It's called a functional derivative because what we are trying to derive or to obtain a derivative from is a function that depends on many parameters. And I'm making a derivative with respect to many parameters as well, which just happens to be summarized by epsilon. So we are making how this big component, big function is changing with respect to a change on the underlying parameters. Those underlying parameters right now is just an epsilon, and the change we're looking at is a change of the distribution or a change of any statistic that you want to think of. So the last step that we need to take in order to know what exactly the reef is to consider that the reef is nothing else than the reef-centered function in the sense of the reef is equal to the original statistic of interest plus this change. So now this reef, as it is constructed here, the way I like to interpret it is that the reef is going to be the contribution that that person has on the construction of your statistic of interest. So if you are dropped to a new sample, this is going to be your reef. This is the original statistic that the population has, plus this is the influence that you're going to have on that population. Of course, this is the blow up, the scale down, or the scaled up influence that you're going to have on the population. If you really want to measure how is it that you're going to affect the population, we have to multiply this times how big you are in the pool. Now, this statistic has very important properties. Number one, if you estimate the average of the influence functions, the average has to be 0. The reason for this is that if you think about what's going on here is, imagine that any statistic of interest the statistic of interest is this point over here in the center. All of these are the data that you're using to obtain those statistics. What the influence function is just a vector that tells you how far they will influence if you move the whole distribution not from this point, but you move it towards that observation. So because this was on the center, when you add up all these arrows, you necessarily will have to go back to the center. Because it's not that I'm really adding any new information to the sample. I'm just assuming what would happen if I add somebody with this observation, then I take it out. Add somebody with a different observations, I take it out, etc., etc. So at the end, the mean shouldn't be affected because all of these points that I'm using to construct the influence function are just going to net out towards 0 at the end. So first characteristic, the expected value of the influence function is equal to 0. Second, because of this, is that the expected value of the reefs is going to be the statistic of interest, which also makes sense. If this is equal to 0, and I'm adding to each person the statistical interest, then my expected value will be the statistical interest. So the expected value of the quantile risk should give me the quantile for interest in. Expected value of the Gini risk should give me the Gini forever. Third, if you want to estimate, well, actually, let me go over here. First, second, third, if you estimate the expected value of the square of the influence function, what that's going to give you is the variance of the influence function, which is equal, well, which will be used to estimate the variance of the statistic itself. So what does it all mean? That if you estimate the RIP of any statistic, you can use that RIP not only to re-estimate the mean, although that's almost even, but also to estimate the variance of the statistic. Now, what does this mean again? Neither of you took the class with Tom in terms of poverty and inequality that semester, right?
I wouldn't do that.
Huh?
I wouldn't do that.
I took the class.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay, so you know what the Gini is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As Tom at any point talked about how to estimate the standard error of the Gini, because the Gini is based on a population, so it's based on a sample, and therefore it's going to come with some standard errors. If he ever told you how to estimate the standard errors for Gini?
It was not part of the whole.
So now that you know bootstrapping, probably you can estimate the variance of the Gini. How do you do that? You apply bootstrap, you estimate the Gini, bootstrap Gini, and you can obtain the empirical standard errors to see how precise that is based on the sample that you have. Now, the analytical version of it would be you estimate the RIP of the Gini, and then you just estimate the mean and the variance of that RIP, and you obtain the distribution of the Gini itself, including the standard errors. How precise your estimation is based on the data that you have. In fact, if you look into my paper, I actually show some simulation results, and that works quite nicely when you compare simulated Ginis and standard errors with the standard error that you get from the reference. Okay, so again, just to close, the influence function is nothing else but how the statistic of interest changes when I rescale it, but how big is the change, assuming that this change is almost infinitesimally small. So we are really talking about a 1% increase in a million observations. So it's the direction on how you think the statistic is going to change. Second, the RIP or central influence function is that function, influence function, plus the mean value. Why we want that? Because when we take the expected value of the RIFs, we get the statistic itself. And when we take the variance of the influence function, or you prefer the variance of the RIF, you can also obtain the variation of your statistic of interest. And this is something that we are always interested in. How do we estimate, or how do we know how precise are our distributional statistics? Now let's move a little bit to the RIF regression part. So let me start by what I had earlier. Okay, so for this, I'm jumping from this equation. I'm going to use this equation to breaking down the same way that I did before to introduce co-bias in the model. So I start from equation number 2 over there and move to this one. So the only thing that I'm doing over here is saying that the unconditional distribution of y can now be divided into components, the conditional distribution times the distribution of x. Now, if I only take this part of the distribution, this is telling me, or this is going to be simplified by saying, I can estimate the statistic of interest by obtaining the conditional mean of the RIF, conditional on x, and multiply by f of x, by how frequent that is. Now, this is important because this is something that we can now model. If we identify what's the drift for the statistic that we want, the only thing that we need to do now in order to analyze policies is to model the conditional expectation in the drift or the conditional drift function. How do you do that? So in your normal regression, instead of using y as your dependent variable, and you're going to use the drift of y, given your characteristics and given the distribution that you have in your data, as a function of x and betas, plus an error, because we're going to just capturing the expected value of all of them. Furthermore, this is not really what we are interested in. What we are interested in is on this. So, or better yet, if I take the expectations, the unconditional expectations of everything, I end up that on the left-hand side, I'm going to be estimating the expected value of the drift, which is nothing else than the statistic of interest. But now that statistic of interest is going to be approximated by some relationship with respect to the x's. But what relationship? That the statistics of interest unconditionally are going to be affected by the mean of the characteristics. And this is my drift regression and conditional regression model. Why is it unconditional? Because I'm interested on the unconditional statistic. It's a drift OLS because I'm going to use an OLS model to estimate the impacts of the relationships. And it's still unconditional effect because I'm going to be measuring the impact only of changes in average of the characteristics. That basically means that the only kind of changes to nexus that we can analyze using drifts, at least at the score, are changes in the average characteristics. And if at some point you read the field proportionality paper, this is what he calls small location change. Because saying that the x's and the means are going to change is saying, I'm going to assume that this was before, this was after, there is a location change in the characteristics of x.
Can I draw something really fast?
Yeah.
Okay. When I make statements, you can correct me. This represents the IF function.
Each one of those arrows, yes.
Okay. Is this and then
I think I know what you want to say. So this is your original distribution.
yeah,
So let me name it this one. This first point one is your original bit.
Yeah.
That is based on the green data that covers the distribution of all the x's.
Okay.
Let's use a different color. Now we have a contamination or a full change of characteristics. For now, let's assume there is a full change of characteristics. Like you say, now you move over here. Right? Now you're gonna have some more data over here.
Mhm.
You can still estimate all of these arrows, right? Well, technically purple colors.
Yeah.
With any data. You can make those predictions using this model.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
can also make the predictions what happens over here. We are now restricting, so now you're getting only up to here.
Yeah, I guess I should say this is the average,
This point will be the average.
the original one,
Yes.
and then the new average.
Is because now we estimated everything, we have to re-estimate again the average over here, and you might move here.
Okay.
So that movement from this to this to this dot is the change that the rate is going to allow you to estimate.
Yeah.
By making approximations on how large or how small these arrows are. Once you make predictions on how those arrows will change, because you're simulating a change on X.
Okay.
Makes better sense?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so in terms of interpretation, then, if I come out of that for any model, what I'm trying to say is how an statistic will change when there is a change on everybody's average, or there is an average change on the population. So I want to make a small distinction between those 2 points because they are very important. In one case, I said, this is the change, assuming that there is a change in everybody's outcome of the same magnitude. So if everybody has an increase of 1 unit, your X in average will increase in 1 unit. And this is what this is able to capture. The same model can still make, is going to predict the same kind of change. If in this case, the change is some people will have a 2-unit increase, 50% of the population have a 2-unit increase, and 50% of the population has a 0-unit increase. In average, their X's are going up in 1 unit. So this will give you exactly the same kind of analysis. In other words, the model, as it was originally proposed by Rios-Avila, when you use a linear probability model, the only thing that you can capture from the distribution of characteristics are distributions at the mean, nothing else. You cannot think about what happens if the variance is changing. You cannot think about what happens if the kurtosis is changing, nothing. At least based on what the model tells you straightforward. There are ways to estimate alternatives, but as the basic model does not allow you to do so. So what's the logic of all of this? The logic is as follows. When there is a change on f of x, so there is a change in characteristics, it will change the distribution of f of y. That change in the distribution of f of y will have a change on this, on the overall distribution. Now, the only thing that we can use to simulate this original change are changes in means, because those changes in means is what is going to make us change the rates. The rate is what is going to make the change on the rates. Okay, so risk regressions works by using a linear approximation. This is quite important because this model, at least again, as originally proposed by Rios-Avila, is a linear model, nothing else but a simple ODS. So it uses a linear model and a linear approximation. Now it's a linear approximation because of this. This is allowing me to make a linear approximation of how the statistic is going to change when there's a change in a small part of the distribution of this. Now, this is something that I always like to emphasize when people use this, is that this will be very good approximation whenever the changes in your distributions is very small. So if you have a population, for example, let's say for saying something, ln of wages is a function of education, age, and sex. So education, possible range for education.
School to PhD.
So let's say realistically, let's consider some dropouts, people who don't finish high school, 11 years, to PhD, which would be 23 years. So about 12 years of a range. Now, what do you think is a reasonable change that is not large compared to these numbers? 1 year is what we normally say. What happens if the population improves in 1 year of education? Now, 1 year might be reasonable for this data. Might be. Saying that everybody increases 1 year of education is probably a little bit very strong. But let's assume it is. What about 5 years? That's not to be too strong of a change, right? My change on the characteristics now is so strong that this linear approximation, which works well when the change is very close, might be very bad when we look at the change that is much larger. So that's the problem with RIFs. RIFs allow you to analyze small changes on your characteristics. And whenever you apply a large change, the results are not as appropriate because they are just approximations of a nonlinear function that is out there. So for age, 18 to 85, here once again, a 1 year change might be a good change. Something else, so I'm going to plug that here. Because we are talking about unconditional effects, it's not that I care so much about the education of each individual, but I think about the education of everybody, and let's just say everybody has given this range 17 years of education. So 1 year to 17 is not that large. To age, let's say 35, 45 years of age, average in the population, and 1 year is no continuous change. Now, what about sex? Number one, can we say, let me change this just because you can only think about, it's much harder to make a scenario when you're going to say there's a change on sex in the population. You can think about it in the sense of, through the years, you're expecting a change in the composition of the labor force. In the last few years, for example, the female labor participation increased, but I think since the 2012 forward, it started to decline once again. So let's talk about something a little bit less controversial, that is unionization. For unionization, either you're going to be unionized or you're going to be non-unionized. And in terms of the magnitude, let's say that you have 10% of the population who is unionized. And let me start moving over. Now, what would be a reasonable change to apply to unions? You cannot say 100% change, for example. Why not? What would it imply if I say, when I want to estimate the coefficient of unions, just as it is? Imagine you're thinking about this not in reprogression, but in OLS. How do you estimate, or what's the interpretation of a coefficient for union?
There would be nothing to measure. There would be no variation in that variable if everyone goes 100%.
But this is what you have originally. This is the data that you have right now. In a linear regression analysis, what is the experiment that you run when you interpret this coefficient?
Why comparing it to the reference level?
Yes. And what's the reference level?
Not in the union.
Exactly. So you're basically saying what happens when the union is either 0 or is 1. And that is very reasonable when you look at that into a single person. Either you are a union or you're not. Now let's go again a step higher and let's think about groups. Still makes sense that you're going to compare this group of 25-year-old, where 50% of the population are women who have 15 years of education, who are not unionized, to this other group that is exactly the same but are unionized. So it still makes sense because you can find two groups. At least you can think about finding two groups that are similar, and you're going to compare the characteristics. What about you have the whole population to think about? Can you still make that thought experiment of comparing the zeros versus all ones? Thinking you could, right? You can say this coefficient is telling me what happens when a population, when everybody is unionized versus nobody being unionized. But that's a very large change in the distribution. You're saying drastically, now everybody will become unionized versus nobody's unionized. Reefs hate when you have a large change in the distribution because they cannot identify the effect clearly. So saying going from 0 to 1 is like saying going from no one is unionized to 100% is unionized. It's a very large change and you cannot really apply it directly. You cannot make interpretations. So what would be a more reasonable analysis of the data? First, you go into how many are unionized. 10%. Okay, based on this, what is a reasonable thought experiment to say how much more this could increase?
10%.
Yeah, that even 10%, I would say, is a lot. But it's much smaller than saying 0 to 100. So let's say that we're going to apply the thought experiment of what would happen if there is a 10% increase in unionization in this population. So how do you interpret the coefficient? We have to get the coefficient and multiply it by 10%. So you have to scale down that coefficient to make the interpretation of what would happen if 10% of the population becomes unionized in the Sun. You see the point? Yeah. Now, similar example, and here is where the 10% might not fit as well. So let's say we are in a highly unionized country, and we have a 91% unionization. Now, in this case, what is the appropriate experiment? What would happen if you say this?
Like a decrease in.
That's an example. That's an option. So instead of talking about what would happen with a 10% increase in unionization, you might want to talk about what would happen if there is a decline in unionization of 10%. Alternatively, you can talk about what would happen if there is an increase in the unionization of, say, 1%. 10% you cannot do it because that means that you will end up with 101% of union workers. Doesn't make sense. But thinking about a 1% increase on union workers, it's a little bit more sensible. The only difference is that now your coefficient, we need to be multiplied by 1%. So that is that's the only point that I always want to emphasize when you have variables that have this kind of distribution, weird distributions. That means, in a case like this, you also want to be careful because if there is a restricted number of levels, you don't want to make a huge change. So let's say I have another variable here, number of children that range between 0 and 5 with an average of 2. What is a good thought experiment there?
The number of kids between 0 and 5 and the average is 2.
Yes. As long as you don't tell me 10, almost any number will be.
That's right.
So
Wouldn't it be better to think of it as like percent of the population with 2?
you can change this and make it as dummies. And in that case, that would be something like the percentage of population with 2 children. So that's another way of modeling something.
But just in this case, a kid, one child. If we're sticking
for
to
this?
yeah, if we're sticking to this.
So if we're going to stick as being yes, a mean, then 1 is what we would normally think about a good experiment, but even 1 might be too much for number of kids, because that means that the fertility rate is increasing in 50%. So for example, like this, it might make sense to talk about what if the number of children in the population increase in average in 0.2 or 0.1. Why? Because in some cases, families will increase, given certain policy, with increasing 1, 2, or 3 children, but some families will have no children at all. Imagine, for example, the impact of the one-child policy in China. This variable, let's say, was between 0 and 5 before, with an average of 2. Probably after the policy was implemented, things declined from 0 to 3, because there were still families that decided to have more than 1 child despite of the negative impacts of their income, plus some families that have twins, unexpectedly, etc. So then let's say that it declines a little bit, but that this declines from 2 to 1.7. So there is a 0.03 decline in the overall number of children over the overall fertility rate. So this is a more appropriate change for something that has this kind of range. So what does generally this means? When you have Rift regression results and you read through them, you cannot interpret the coefficients as you normally do, because you need to be very careful into thinking about, is that a reasonable change? Or what kind of change we're trying to impose to the data?
Because you're always talking in average.
Exactly.
Okay.
For
That's why it
rates,
doesn't have to be discrete.
you always talk about averages. And that's the problem with RIFs. So in terms of why it works and why it not. RIF works using the linear approximation. The RIF itself is an approximation, just like a derivative. In which all the changes that we are trying to simulate on Y come because the changes on X are approximated by changes on the means, only changes on the means. So again, you have to think about if the 1 unit change in the mean makes sense for the particular model you're using. Now, this is also going to be very important because a lot of the time people rely on these models, they tend to say something like, if a person increases their income or their age in 1 unit, if a person increases their income 1 unit, their position in the distribution is going to change, it's going to increase. You cannot do that. Because when there is a change on only 1 person, the overall increase that your statistic will be affected by will be 0, especially when you have a very large sample of population. Does that make sense? If in a population of the whole planet, you drop a person that has average income or that has $10 of income per day, how will the average income in the population for the whole planet change? Almost nothing. There's going to be a change, but the change is going to be so small that you won't be able to identify it. So that's why changes at the individual level are not interesting. And the second one is that you cannot really follow the changes of particular percentiles. So let's say that person 1 is at the 10th percentile. There is all these changes and characteristics. It's not that he's going to remain on the 10th percentile. It's not that he's going to increase his percentile to be in 20, 11, 99. You do not know. You just know that before, somebody at the 10th percentile had a certain level of income, and after somebody at the 10th percentile will have a higher or lower income. In other words, for RIF regressions, we cannot make the ranking bias assumption that helps you to interpret things, but you cannot make it a running assumption.
So we started this whole RIF talk by talking about dropping a person into a pool, but it should really be dropping an average effect into the pool.
Yes and no. So the if statistic is as if you drop in 1 person to the pool and see what happens. But the change is you do 1 person at a time until you cover every single person in the population. So some of these individuals are going to be affected by your policy. So you can identify this RIF effect by looking at what happens to those individuals. But at the end, you're averaging over everything. So the other problem, again, that I was mentioning and that has been brought up already, that unless you have a very flexible model specification, the only thing that you can identify are changes on the mean of X, because everything is at the means. There is a possibility, however, to include at least second moments of the distribution of X's. And I'm going to leave that for you reading on my paper, because I explained there why do I think it's possible to include a second order moment on the distribution, meaning that I can somehow modify my model to allow not only for changes on the mean to affect the outcome, but also changes on the variances. Finally, because this is just a linear approximation, the RIF itself is a linear approximation, and we're using on top of that an OLL, so it's an approximation of an approximation. The approximations are going to be bad whenever you think about a change on X that is too large, as we were discussing over there. When the change that you're trying to analyze is too much for the data, then the results are not going to be reasonable, not always reasonable. The most relevant examples are the cases of dummies or treatment effects. Now, a little bit of dummies, and I already mentioned about that. Interpreting dummies in RIF regressions are a challenge because we are still very ingrained to analyze the coefficient themselves to analyze the dummy. However, as I was explaining over here, the change that you have to keep in mind is not a change on the variable itself, because that means a variable for the individual. You have to think about a change on the average to really consider what is a reasonable change for that particular statistic. So in this case, what percentage is unionized? Then I can say about something about what is reasonable to think about a change in the unionization. A 1% increase in unionization might have certain impact on wages. The problem that we had, where if you start reading about papers that talk in terms of unconditional quantized regressions, is that the majority will say, even the original papers say, and that's the part that I never really went back to make a discussion on how they interpret the models, is that they make interpretation of the coefficient of union as if that would be the impact on the unconditional quantile. They just look at the coefficient, which is incorrect. You should really be looking at what is a correct approximation, not what happens between unionized and non-unionized, because that change is too large and RIFs cannot identify that. Now, actually, let me give that as a plus points, extra points for next week, especially because nobody read the papers.
I read your paper. Not all of it yet.
Well, and Nitin is not here, so Nitin will also have the chance, and I will send him an email. This is your task, and it's a very small one. I want you to find within Firpo 14 and the new paper, there is one paragraph that they say, how should one interpret things like this? And they explain what I say, but even they do not reflect that in their analysis. So it's one paragraph out of 40 pages that you need to find.
What paper?
The unconditional quantized regression Firpo 14 and the new.
May you please write it by email because I can see nothing on the board?
Could you say, excuse me? Oh, I thought you were able to see some over here. I might have to change this. What you couldn't see?
I can't see anything on the board. I'm trying to.
Yeah. So what I was trying to say is, whenever you estimate a RIF regression, well, whenever you estimate a regression, can you see this better, by the way? Shan?
Yes, I can read it.
Okay, so what I said over here is the following. When you estimate risk regression, and for now, let's just write it as ln of wage, but here it's actually the risk. What we have a tendency to do is to interpret these results as we would do for a standard linear regression. For example, alpha 1 is the impact of one additional year of age on wages. Alpha 2 is the impact of an additional year of education on wages and union, and alpha 3 is the impact of being unionized versus non-unionized on wages. Right? That's what we normally would interpret the results. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, for real regressions, what you think about, what you need to think about is what you try to do is the expected value of real is equal to the expected value of alpha 2, the expected value of age, alpha 1, alpha 2, the expected value of education, plus alpha 3, the expected value of unionization. So whenever you interpret these coefficients, what you need to think about is not a change on age in education or union, but what is the change on the expected value of age, so how the population as a whole is aging, the expected value of education, how the population as a whole is getting more or less educated, and the expected value for union in the sense of as a whole, what is the change in the unionization rate of on the population. And based on that concept is that you have to make any kind of interpretations of the risk coefficients. Now, what I said is Firpo, Fortini, and Lemieux have one paragraph in all their paper, is in the first part of the paper, that they explain how one should consider the impacts of unions.
In which paper?
Unconditional quantile regressions by Firpo, Fortini, and Lemieux. If you click on the presentations, it's linked to this.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so where were we? Oh. So again, why it's a problem with unions or with dummy variables? Because you cannot make the change from 0 to 1, since that's a large change. You need to think about what's an appropriate change based on the average of characteristics already. However, it is possible to restructure real regressions and make it possible to estimate treatment effects, meaning still being able to make the comparisons of unions versus non-unions. And the key, which I also I come back and explain the problem of how it can be approached in the 2023 paper, but also my 2020 paper, where it basically says real regressions can be used to analyze overall effects of dummies if the reef is created based on a conditional distribution as well. What do I mean with that? So right now, I rather like to go here, so you can also see. Sorry, I put the volume. So right now, the way the reef is being created is that this reef is equal to the statistic plus the influence function for a particular statistic for a very specific unconditional distribution and for a particular point in the distribution. That's why this changes based on which y we're using. Now, this doesn't change when characteristics are changing, because all depends on this unconditional distribution. So how can we make this real change when there is a large change in the distribution? Any ideas? Simple. And yes, I know, Sean, it's simple when you have worked with it for quite a while. So I can estimate the reef when a dummy is equal to 1 and the reef when the dummy is equal to 0, which means I'm going to have the statistic when the dummy is equal to 1, the statistic when the dummy is equal to 0, plus the influence function when the distribution is conditional, and the other one when the distribution is also conditional. So the trick that I'm using here to be able to use reef regressions for quantile treatment effects or for treatment effects in general, meaning comparing two groups with one with a dummy equal to 0, rapid equal to 1, unionization, unions, versus non-unions, etc., is by saying I can just make sure that I introduce the changes in the distribution directly when I control or when I estimate the reefs. Technically speaking, I could estimate this reef conditional on X, which is equal to the statistic conditional on X plus the influence function of Y conditional on X. I could estimate my reef regression using this approach, but kind of defeats the purpose because the overall idea of the reef regression is that I don't need to estimate this for all the possible, not sure how much you can see over there, but the overall idea of using reef regression is that I shouldn't have the need to estimate the conditional distributions for every combination of characteristics. So doing this is possible. In some cases, we're going to have one observation, so it doesn't make sense. And that's why it's better to do that either for the unconditional one or at the extreme for a single variable, a single conditional variable. Okay, an example. So for this case, I'm going to use I'm going to tell you how I would interpret the results just based on the reef regression as it is. But I'm also going to modify it slightly so I can estimate treatment effects that are similar to the ones that I estimated before. So for the first part, I'm going to estimate what is the change of my possible policy. Okay, so, and I'm going to keep that on the background just because it's something we need, but not something that you need to see right now. But we're going to use that factor for later. So how do we estimate reef regressions? In Stata, the command for reef regressions is reef hdreg. You need to install it, and to install it, you will need to do ssc install reef. The idea is to use this just as any other regression command, where the first variable is the variable that you're trying to analyze the unconditional distribution of. In this case, it's going to be for citations. Afterwards, you include all the variables that you want to make the function of. In this case, it's going to be the level of finds, the types of the city size, set of dummies, whether or not the college degree, whether or not the town is a college town, or the type of taxes that they have. After the comma, you need to specify what type of reef you're interested in. For now, we're just going to concentrate on quantiles, where that's why I'm including here the reef Q10, Q20, or Q50, Q90. But you could just as well estimate other kinds of analysis. So if you do help reef or help reef hdreg, you're going to have the full set of statistics that I include within the package. So I'm estimating this for everything to show true effect. Okay, so these three first regressions are the straightforward regressions that I'm going to get using the command. Now, when I estimate this some change in fines, and if I run this, actually I could just run it over here. I see that the policy that I'm trying to create generates a change in fines of 0.21 in average. And this is because fines, let's see, these fines were measured in thousands of dollars. So this means that in average, the policy that I'm trying to create creates a change in fines of about an increase on $210. Or $210 plus 50 cents in average. So the first two regressions estimate their regression model, straightforward. The other three that I have here estimate the model rescaling all the coefficients by this factor that I found before. And the only reason why I want to do that is to make the interpretations of the fines coefficient straightforward. Okay, so let me concentrate on these ones first. How do we interpret these results? Fines. So all the interpretation of these results are going to be respect to an average change on fines of 1 unit, which means what if fines are increased in $1,000 for everybody. If that's the case, according to this, there is a decline in the number of citations, and the decline is going to be about 0.4 per citations for the 10 quintile, for the 10 quintile, up to 9.8 citations for whoever, or for the 98 quintile. Okay. So just to keep that also in mind. And then you go over here. Originally, for the 10 percentile, of the 10 quintile, one had only 11.5 citations in average. So that's the number of citations that you would see at the 10 percentile. At the 19th percentile, you had 34 citations. So you look at the distribution of citations. Here, where this is 10%, this is 90%. This is the 34.5. 28 is around here. Because here is 50%. Here is 20.86. And at the 10 percentile is 11.5. So at the 10 percentile, it's 11.5. Now, this is the distribution of citations. Now, what this is saying, what if we impose a change on fines of $1,000 for a year? According to this, the 10 percentile will decrease to 11.5. So this is going to change. And the new one will be 11.5 minus 4.77. So about 6. In the next one, same idea, 1,000 increase in fines, so a 1 unit increase in fines for everybody. Going to this, it declines in 6.7. So it would go from 20.86 to about 13. Well, let's say 13 approximately. So again, a decline for the 90th as well, and it's going to be on 9 points, from 34 to 25. So in all the cases, it seems that there is going to be a contraction of the distribution for almost everybody. Now that is for the case of pines. What about for the cases of city size? Now city size is a dummy. Therefore, we need to know how many people we're talking about in each dummy. So let me say city size. We have 35% in the small, 29 in the medium, and 35 in large. So what would be a good thought experiment for each one of these dummies? How much would you like to play around with? No answer is worse than any answer.
I don't think I'm interpreting.
This is just the distribution. How many are in each row? So if these are the distribution that you're observing, how much change you would like to generate here? 100% change? A 1% change? 20% change? How much?
10%.
Okay, let's go with 10 because it's easier. So 10% change would mean that suddenly the medium size gets boosted up from 29 to 39%. Now, where will we be taking that 10% off? That's the other question that you need to ask yourself in this case.
Equally from the other two.
Yes, that would be the ideal way to do it. But because we have a left out group, we have to take it from the base group.
Oh, because it's okay.
Yes.
So it has to come from small.
Yeah. So if we take some of people from the small and they become part of the medium, so there is a 10% increase in the medium, accompanied by 10% decrease on the small, we're going to see that that citations are going to increase by how much? I have to multiply these times that change. So citations might increase in 0.46 citations, and the median in 0.73 citations, and the 90th on 6.4 citations. So artificially, they seem very small changes now, but these are going to be small changes because we're saying this is a dummy, and we need to measure the impact based on how many people are going to move from one size to the other, or how much the composition is going to change. So the same for city size, for college and taxes. But in this case, we don't really need to look much into this statistic because we only have one, but it's always good practice. So we have 24% are college cities and 70% are taxes. So the 10% is still reasonable. Okay. So once again, we interpret this. If there is an increase on the number of cases that are from college, or the sample increases and there are more college found in this sample, the number of citations at the 10 percentile will increase in 0.29, at the medium in 0.6, at the top in almost 1 unit. For taxes, the same, decline in 0.3, 0.3, 0.8. Now, let's see that I want to compare these numbers now to what I had before, meaning I want to make the same kind of analysis as I did before, meaning what would be the impact if, in average, fines would decline in $200? For that, I would have to look into the results, because these are already multiplied these times the average change that I saw on fines. Do you see myself? I see some. Did you get the point?
I think I missed that with the second.
Okay, so
batch.
the second batch, first of all, In order to make the results from the risk regression comparable to the other strategies that I described, I first need to know what does it mean, or how do I interpret this change on the policy? This change on the policy means that in average, there's going to be an increase in fines on 0.21048. So you think about it, if I impose this change of this policy in my data set, it means that I want to increase in average fines in $200 with $210. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody's experiencing the same kind of change.
Oh, okay.
It means some people experience no change because they were already at the top 12. Some other experience a lot of change because they were at the bottom. But in average, they are experiencing a change of 21.048. Number one. Number two, when I'm estimating these models, I'm already rescaling them. Let me increase the size of the font. I'm rescaling them using that coefficient or that factor that I found. So I could only interpret fines using this rescale factor. So if I do that, I can really measure the impact of the policy under the assumption that the linear approximation is correct. So if I impose that policy and fines increase in average $200 at the 10th percentile, you're going to see a small decline on the number of citations, but you're going to see the largest decline in number of citations at the top. All right. Let's see what else I included here. Only that. So this is now when I was trying to present to you the different versions on how to estimate this unconditional effect using unconditional control regressions, regressions, with reweighted analysis, with the simulation analysis, and well, those are the three. So reweighting, simulation using heteroscedastic regression model, using quantile regressions, and using risk regressions. And all of these approaches, in this case, give me a very similar result. So you can, to some extent, this would constitute as also as a sort of robustness if I will be doing this in a paper, because I'm saying all the methodologies that I'm applying give me a very similar result. Perhaps with the simulation based on the heteroscedastic regression, which is the most constrained one of all the models, because it's saying that the conditional distribution only depends on the conditional mean and the conditional variance. That gives me the lower results, which is very similar to the weighted analysis. I mean, you smooth out the simulated analysis, probably would give me something similar to heteroscedastic regressions. Now, the other two models that are a little more flexible, simultaneous or simulation using quantile regressions, conditional quantile regressions, and risk regressions, they are giving me results that are almost identical for most of the cases, except perhaps for the very end.
What's on the Y here?
This is the actual effect, the impact that the policy on fines is generating on the number of citations. So just like before, at the very bottom, there is a very small impact on citations. At the very top, there is a larger impact. Which means that if we introduce this policy in the economy or in this particular setup, there's going to be a compression on the number of citations and compressions from the top. So the people who were doing this quite often will reduce their risky behavior, but perhaps the ones who are at the top might reduce it a little bit as well, which we are seeing some of that here, but not as much. Now it's possible they don't do it as much because this is in absolute numbers. So there is not much space for them to reduce. They were already doing well, so there is not much else where they could reduce. All right, so some other considerations. Risk regressions are useful, but one must use them with care because of all those large impacts. It's possible to use risk regressions for treatment effects, but again, you have to be very explicit. For most of the cases, you should only think about small changes. Large changes may be meaningless. Sometimes will give you good results, but more often than not, when every time that you try to apply a large change, interpret dummies, for example, the results are going to be odd. Now, in terms of the application, C-RIF, C-RIF, which is HD-REC, Stata has a full complement to that. I wrote it, so you should use it. But you want to do this outside of the Stata. I know that R has a command. I think it's UQ-REC that somebody wrote. I'm not sure they are still maintaining it. And as far as I know, there is nothing in Python. So I'm not sure you can actually do that in Python. But doing it is not too difficult, because the only thing that you need to know is what is the RIF for a particular statistic. Just for you to know, for the mean, for example, the RIF of any variable is the variable itself. Because of that, OLS can be thought as a very specific or a special case of race relations. For the variance, you would like to talk about how much the dispersion of a variable changes. The RIF of a variance is nothing else than the variable minus the mean square. And that's what you will try to explain. For the quantile, is the quantile itself, tau, which is which quantile you're trying to look at, and a dummy that tells you if this is above or below the quantile. And all divided or rescaled by the density. And here perhaps I would point to say the problem with RIF relations when you try to estimate quantiles and to estimate standard errors is that we usually consider this the denominator, the density, as fixed. However, then the density is not fixed. It's something else that we should introduce for estimation of standard errors. So if you would like to estimate the standard errors, everything that you have done in terms of robust ties, so sandwich estimators can be applied and you're going to get correct standard errors. For almost all statistics, again, except for quantiles, because you also need to take into account the distributional function or the density function. Final words on RIF. Because the implementation is at the end of the day linear regression models, you can also add any number of fixed effects and you're still be fine. You don't have to worry about other problems that come for nonlinear models when you apply fixed effects. Of course, you could, if you wanted to, skip the linear regression model altogether and just apply a RIF or apply a model that is appropriate to that RIF. For example, and I'm going to leave that for you to think about before we go into a RIF. If you're trying to talk about something like the Gini, the RIF for the Gini is always increasing and it's always positive. A better model to estimate something that is always positive is a Poisson. So you could use a Poisson, and that would be a much better approximation for the RIF. For quantiles, the key to estimate a quantile is not any of these parameters because all of these are fixed, but this. And this is just a dummy. So you could estimate a RIF regression better using a logic or a probit model by modeling explicitly this component. In fact, in the paper, people for New, they provide you results showing you what happens when you estimate the RIF regressions using an OLS, which is what my reference direct does, or using a probit model, but it only focuses on this. Now, you want to do something like that? You can also look into UQ-REC in a Stata, which actually allows you to estimate the model using logics, probits, or other models, if you want.
There is more information on that slide. I'm ready for a break.
Well,
I don't know. if
this is what I was telling you before. When that tree benefits, you can break down the distribution. Or if you want to account, and this is what I said, you can read my paper, you can, if you want to account for other moments, in addition to x, you can add x minus, it means square. Because when you take the expected value of this, what do you get? On that thought, you can take a break and tell me when you come back.
So what did you want us to do with that paper?
Find the point where he says, this is how you interpret the dummy. And he says that explicitly for unions.
Well, like earlier in the paper, he's like, they need to be interpreted differently.
Because these are local. I forget the language he uses, something like shift. Local shift effect, I believe.
And we have to commit that paragraph to memory. And then when we come into class tomorrow, we just point at us.
And then we
And
have
we have
to,
to, each of us have to recite a sentence of it.
yeah.
You're giving me ideas.
We have to write a song about it.
Yeah, we're gonna song about it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take the song approach, if that's all right.
Written by you or written by GPT?
I'll write it. All right.
A small location shift, that's the word that he uses. We represent this small location shift in the distribution of X in terms of the counterfactual distribution of G. That basically means the only way we can make interpretations is by assuming that X in average changes in some amount. That's what I said. This is one of those papers that took me a while to understand everything.
Okay, but then later on, I didn't get to the actual interpretation part yet, but presumably they don't.
There is only a part they make again, and they skip it completely on their own interpretation. I think at least that they skip it. But I'm gonna see.
That get the 10mm spanner. Yeah, it's working.
I felt bad. That's the paragraph. Page 11, last paragraph before section 4.
Yeah.
That's paragraph.
That's the paragraph. And it's only at one sentence where he explains how to interpret impacts on dummies, but he never mentions that in the rest of the paper, except perhaps at the very beginning. Even here, he doesn't make the emphasis that these well, here is what is important is like in the example unit status, the unconditional contract partial effect, which is the treatment effect of the data that we're interested, represents the impact of a small change in the probability of being unionized, instead of a small change on the location of a continuous variable. So it's not that we can talk about everybody increasing one unit. It is that we need to talk about the probability that they are given one. Now the problem with this, and that they don't say, is how do we quantify this small change? Because when he actually they actually present the results, the empirical results. Why find it here? Yes, yes, I'm going to compare what happens when I compare the conditional contact relation effects to the unconditional effects. But this is for unions. Union is a dummy. For a dummy, these numbers are correct for conditional relation. These numbers are not exactly correct because it assumes that you're going from no unionized to fully unionized. So those numbers are not exactly correct.
Couldn't you like take some first? No, I was trying to think if we take some like incremental percentage of each of the conditional. I don't think so.
You're going to the other thing that he says. And that's why I do the simulation version.
Mm-hmm.
What he says is that the unconditional effect is really a weighted average of all the possible conditional effects. But the problem is you do not know. Think about this, and this is something that I learned on this other paper that they just brought out. I might carefully clarify the intuition here. So imagine that.
So are there you have a peanut allergy?
Yeah.
Or-
No, God. No. Yeah. So all of these, let's say this is my Q50, Q90, Q10, Q90, Q75, Q25. So all of these are your conditional contact relations. Now, what he's saying is that the unconditional effect could be obtained by simply looking at the distribution over here. Let's say this is the quantile of interest, the just say something the 70th quantile. I could average this effect plus this effect plus this effect plus this effect plus this effect, and I can figure out how this will move.
Mhm.
That's what this equation is telling. The problem here is that at least I have not yet figured out how to do that with this other paper just a month ago. Suggest a version is how to estimate these weights because they depend on X. But yes, it's possible to obtain this unconditional effect using conditional relations. Now, the method that I suggested is you just do everything and then you average again. Okay. So next in the agenda, it's going nonlinear. So this will definitely take a couple of classes. I don't think we can finish everything this class, which means that in 2 classes, Sham, you're up with the presentations, and you can find that the list of presentations of the other presentations on Brightspace. It's on the first stuff, the general characteristics of the course. Let's see if I can.
Course tour, presentation.
You found it?
We,
Yes, so. Oops, no. Course overview. So first comes Sham in the next class with one paper that should be applicable to potential outcomes and causal effects, in particular randomized control trials. Next will be meeting with IB. Then, sorry, meeting with panel data, then done with IB, meeting again with matching, then with the recurrent discontinuity. In differences, we're going to have 2 papers. Dan and Sham are going to present something on that. We're going to end the official presentations with Jonathan on synthetic control methods. And remember, in addition to this, most likely towards the last day of classes is your paper presentation, your own paper presentation. Okay. So, going non-linear. Everything that we have seen so far, quantile regressions, semi-parametric models, non-parametric models, lassos, etc., all of them have, to one extent or another, refer to the estimation of linear regression, sometimes very complicated linear regressions, but still that could be solved using simple OLS, except for quantile regressions. Quantile regressions, because you're looking into a different statistic of interest, the specific quantile, that is a nonlinear function of the outcome, you needed to do something other than a linear regression. You remember, and I hope you do, the outcome of interest, or rather, when you estimate a quantile regression, what you do is you modify your loss function, which is normally just equal to the residual square. You modify it to the absolute of the errors. So this is, at the end of the day, what differentiates a linear regression model from the median regression model. And this median regression model is nothing else but the strictly quantile regression. But what if you're interested on relationships that are truly nonlinear? And when I'm talking about a nonlinear model, I refer a model where the outcome is no longer a linear function of characteristics. So it doesn't matter, remember, that whatever function this has, x, x squared, log of x, sinus x, etc., etc., etc. This model is still linear for 2 reasons. One of them, because all the coefficients are just multiplying, or the coefficients are having a linear impact on the outcome. And the second reason was that our errors were having a direct linear impact on y. Now the question is, what happens if you're interested in something more complex? Something, for example, like you're interested in estimating people that have taken the class with Ajit Rukadny, a Cobb-Douglas model. what is your interest on something like this? Estimating a cost model. Or estimating, I don't know, a kind of equivalence scale where my welfare is a function of some weight that I put to the cost of people with different ages. These two cases are going to be cases of nonlinear regressions because the coefficients of interest do no longer have a linear impact on the outcome. Some of them may, like in this case, but for the majority, they are not going to be linear relationship to the outcome. Now, this also means that the nice formula that I can bring into your brain betas no longer works, which means that the betas are no longer going to be just a simple nice weighted functions of x's. That relationship may no longer be there. So how do we come into modeling something like that? As I mentioned before, there are many approaches, but I'm going to try to cover 3 of them in this class. Nonlinear least squares. That's going to borrow a lot of what we have learned from regular ordinary least squares. It's based on the same principles with a tweak. Iteratively weighted least squares, which again is still based on analysis of least squares, but allows you to account for more information on the model. It borrows some of what we have learned here, and it's going to borrow some of the things that we have learned in the past last semester for regression analysis. And finally, maximum likelihood estimation. Maximum likelihood estimation is a truly flexible approach to estimate almost any kind of model under certain assumptions. Can be complicated to solve it, but the principles of it can really allow you to do almost any kind of model.
What is NLS again?
Non-linear least squares. So let's start with that. So what is non-linear? So let's consider all these functions back here. All of them are non-linear because, as you can see, in none of the situations the beta have a clear direct approach or direct impact on y's. However, some of these models are linearizable. And when I say linearizable, it means that I can apply some transformation on the model that could once again make a clear relationship between some transformation of the outcome and the betas. For example, there is nothing that I can do for this model to make it linear. Absolutely nothing. Now, what about these two? Is there anything you can do for them? Do they look similar to you? Do they don't? Which one would be linearized? First one or second one?
Second one.
Why?
Well, the error term isn't a part of the exponential function.
That's one of the reasons, yeah. Now, how would you make it a linearizable model? How would you linearize that model?
It's just pick a log of those sides.
So this would be, actually, this is what we do for most of the wage regressions, right? We use the local wages as a function of characteristics, plus an error. You cannot do that on this one, even though it looks very similar, because the error is explicitly outside of the model, therefore you cannot just take the logs and assume that something will happen with that error. This one is semi-linear, because the main index of interest is a linear combination of characteristics, but it's not fully linearizable because the error, as Dan was saying, is outside of the model. So there is no transformation that I can apply here that will make this model a simple linear function, simple linear regression function. On the last one, however, you still can do something, assuming that this function h is monotonic, you can find, or assuming that there is an h minus 1, there is an inverse function, you could apply that here and still estimate the model.
Professor, are you writing on the second board?
Nope.
Okay.
I was just saying, if there is an h inverse, then you can make function 5 linear. And that's actually what I also say over here. Models 2 and 4, you could apply logs. And actually shouldn't be 2 and 4, should be 3 and 5. You can apply logs or the h1 function, if there is such a function, and use OLS. However, for all other models, you can't just use OLS to estimate it. So how do we estimate those models? So how do you do nonlinear regressions? Again, nonlinear is going to be tricky because in contrast with our good old OLS regression, there is no closed form solution to the model. So there is no easy to say betas are going to be equal to x transpose x times x transpose y. There is nothing like that. There's going to be something similar, but not exactly. In fact, we already saw something like this. When we're estimating quantized regressions, at no point I told you that there is a nice function to derive the betas for quantized. If you check the notes, we just say they need to fulfill this condition. You can construct them based on these other elements and the short-term assumptions, but there is no clear solution on how do you come up with the true betas. There is no x transpose x anywhere. So what we're going to do in this section is that we are going to cover one of the first one of the methodologies that is available for the estimation of this kind of nonlinear models. And when I say this kind of nonlinear models, I'm going to explicitly refer to models like this one, where you have a nonlinear relationship H that has some linear combinations or nonlinear combinations of x's and betas. That's why I'm saying here just x comma beta. But that we're going to assume that the error is additive to the model. That's going to be the only condition I'm applying to this model. So what's going to make this a non-linear least square model? That we are making the explicit assumption that the error adds to the model, or in other words, is going to add to the conditional expectation function. Now, in contrast to the linear regression model, is that our conditional expectation function, CDF, will be represented by some non-linear relationship of characteristics. Now, because we are still using an because we are still looking at non-linear least square model, an emphasis on the least squares, is that you can still apply the same logic as in OLS, meaning you're trying to find the betas or the parameters that are going to minimize the sum of the square residuals of your model. So let's go ahead and start doing something like that. But before, some assumptions. How do we know that our model is identified, and how do we know that our model is going to be consistent and unbiased? Nonlinear least squares are going to have very similar assumptions to the standard OLS. First of all, we need to make sure, or we need to assume that whichever functional form we're choosing is the right one for our conditional expectation function. So before we used to say the expectation of y and x in the past, we used to say that the conditional expectation function will have to be a linear function of characteristics. But now what we are saying is we're going to be a little bit more flexible by allowing this function to be something like this. Alpha 0, alpha 1, x, alpha 2, plus alpha 2, Z, alpha 3, alpha 4. So basically saying all of x's might have a nonlinear relationship, or rather all the coefficients are going to have nonlinear relationship in terms of the conditional expectation function. Now, this doesn't need to be like this. It could be any function that you might want. Okay. So first assumption is the same one basically as for OLS. We believe that our model is correctly specified, and that is the best way to represent the population relationship in the conditional expectation function. Second, there is a unique solution. So this is going to be an assumption similar to the multicollinearity. It basically says that if you find a beta that minimizes the errors, so you find a solution for that model, there is no other beta combination that will give you the same solution unless all the betas are the same. Now, how does this differ for the multiple collinearity problem? In a standard linear regression analysis, we said, for example, that you cannot estimate this model if X is some linear combination of Z. So there is no perfect linear collinearity, because if this exists, the determinant of this is 0, therefore it doesn't have an inverse, therefore you cannot estimate the model. Alternatively, this also means that for any value of alpha 1, you can find a value for alpha 2 that still minimizes the standard error, or sorry, the sum of square residuals in your model. Now, for nonlinear models, it's slightly different, because let's assume that this is still true. You could still estimate your model if the relationship is something like this: alpha 0 plus alpha 1 x plus alpha 2 b alpha 3. This would be allowed because now, even though z and x are collinear, z is affected differently on this model, so it's going to have a different impact on y. By allowing this nonlinearity, therefore, I can apply models where my variables are perfectly collinear. The solution, however, requires that whenever we find this alpha hat based on some minimization problem, there is no other alpha hat or alpha tilde that gives me the same minimum. So there is no other solution for exactly the same model. Graphically, what does this mean? It means that if you have something like this as your, let's say this is my sum of the square residuals, and this is my beta, that you need that your model always gives you something like this. So there is only one beta that minimizes the sum of the square residuals. If you happen to have a beta that is more or less like where there are two combinations of betas that minimizes your results, then the model is not identified because you do not know which one of these is the one that is truly representing your model. That's what this assumption number 2 says. Assumption number 3, just like we had before, or a very similar approximation to what we had before. In OLS, we usually say we want the expected value of the errors to be 0, but also the expected value of the errors conditional on x to be 0. Why do we want this? What's the implication of that assumption?
The heteroscedasticity.
Heteroscedasticity is square. This is the zero conditional mean, which means all your variable x's are exogenous. If your x's are exogenous, then you can identify the betas and you can make causal inferences of the or causal interpretation of your model. Now, in nonlinear least squares, it only requires that in average, the error should be 0 for identification. And notice, as we do not require the x's to be completely independent from the error, but we require that the function, the combination of all those x's with the betas, the expected value based on those, to be equal to 0. So it's a very similar, but not exactly the same conclusion. So this is going to be similar to non-endogeneity, or you prefer exogeneity of the numbers, but it's going to be constrained to the functional form that we're using. So sometimes we can make things exogenous by choosing the correct functional form. That's more or less what this is trying to touch. Finally, we need well-behaved data. And this is another case that we didn't really have for OLS. So we have for OLS but only in a passing. For OLS, we require that our data is well-behaved in the sense of you have a mean, assumption 1, you have no correlation on the errors, and you have an homoscedastic error. Or even if it's heteroscedastic error, it's still with some constraint. You don't want results that are all over the place. This is what this assumption is telling you. Data well-behaved means that it doesn't matter if you have a problem with over-dispersion or under-dispersion, you want to be able to estimate that variance. If you cannot estimate that variance, then you cannot use nonlinear least squares. Now, I'm talking about not the variance of the sample, because that one always exists, but the variance of the population. Under these assumptions, it is possible to estimate the coefficients of interest on a nonlinear least square model. How? Okay, so for this, we're going to need a little bit, and with a little bit, I mean a lot of math, just to understand what's happening here. So, for nonlinear least squares, just as with OLS, we need to minimize the sum of the square residuals, and that's going to be my equation number 1. We're really trying to minimize the sum of the square residuals, or if you prefer, maximize how close my nonlinear function is to the outcome of interest. So this is this equation over here, which in matrixal form, I can express it as this, which is just the cross product of the residuals in my model, if I'm talking about it as in vector sense. Okay, so something that I'm not sure you remember, but when you do this in OLS, the first thing you need to do to estimate the betas is obtain your first order conditions, because you want to find those points where the function is flat, since you believe those flat points are going to be the indication of a minimum of a maximum. So we need to first condition on the first order. We need to establish what are the first order conditions for your model and set them up equal to 0. So my first order condition is deriving the sum of the square residual with respect to betas, which is equal to all of this times this, which I'm going to change a little bit of the name of this. I'm going to say that this derivative of the nonlinear function with respect to beta, I'm going to call it the x tilde. Now, in many textbooks, they are going to reflect this x tilde as pseudo regressors, because they are not exactly the regressors themselves, are not the variables that are found in your data, but are the ones that come from this particular function. So all of these equal to 0. I will have to finalize with this to be equal to 0. Now, so far so good, with the exception that this set of equations given by the first order conditions is going to be a non-linear set of equations. And I do not know you, but in grad school, I never really learned how to estimate or how to solve non-linear set of equations. So how do we estimate this? One way of doing it is using a second order Taylor expansion. Now, a second order Taylor expansion is something that we have covered slightly already. I don't know how much you remember about the delta method. Do you recall when I talk about the delta method and Taylor expansions? Be honest, if you don't remember, I'm not going to be too upset. Any function, I'm talking about any function you can think of, can be locally linearized. So it doesn't matter if your function is extremely complex, but as long as it's a function, well, it doesn't count. As long as it's a proper function, if you look locally, you can always make a linearization of that particular point, always. Making a linearization is the equivalent to using a first order Taylor expansion. Because what you're saying is that this function that I do not know x can be expressed as a point of interest, that point that I want to make the approximations by, plus the derivative on that point and how far I want to look away from that point. So if this is my approximation here, this is the point, I can know what's value here using just a linear approximation. It depends on how flat or non-flat, what's the slope of my function, and how far I want to make the interpretation of that function. So that's a first order approximation. Now, what I'm saying over here is a first order approximation. It's a good first approximation. It's actually what we did for Greek questions. We use the first order approximation on how a change in the distribution will affect a statistic. Here, however, we're going to now refer to a second order approximation. And a second order approximation basically says, instead of using this, let's use a quadratic function. So in all of these, I'm going to use a quadratic function, etc., to figure out what happens around this point. And this is this second order approximation, which is the sum of the square residuals for beta. Now, for any other beta is going to be equal to the sum of the square residuals for a first choice of beta, plus how those residuals are going to change my first order conditions or gradients when I move a little bit farther from the beta, plus how far they are going to move once I look at the second order condition. So I want to look not only at the slope, but also how that slope is changing to figure out how a better approximation for this sum of square residuals. So far, so good? Yes? At least the logic. We're making a second order approximation, meaning we are going to use a quadratic function to try to approximate something that is inherently already quadratic. So it should be good enough. Okay, so I'm going to change a couple of things here. This gradient is equal to this. This is what I already have over here. And this Hessian, which is the derivative of the gradient with respect to the betas, is going to be just 2 times x tilde transpose x tilde. You can demonstrate this, for now, not relevant to see where that is coming from. Suffice to say that this h is what you obtain when you derive these with respect to betas. Is the double derivative of that function. And finally, that this x tilde is just how h changes when there is a change in beta. So First order conditions again. My first order condition comes from just deriving this function rather than this one. This function with respect to beta. And not beta, but well, I'm going to derive with respect to beta, not beta 0. Beta 0, I'm going to assume that is constant because it's the point of reference that I'm using to find some beginning of the solution. So if I derive with respect to beta, this is equal to 0, so I can forget about it. This would only be the gradient because this is a constant. And this I will not be, this is going to be a constant, so I do not need to worry about it. I just need to derive this and this with respect to beta. And that gives me this function. So relatively simple. The gradient plus the Hessian times how far I am from the Hessian. All that equal to 0, because that's my first order condition. So let me do some math and make some transfers from one side to the other. And it gives me that beta minus beta 0 is equal to the negative of the inverse of the equation times the gradient, all evaluated at beta 0 because that's the point that I have as reference. Now, there is no guarantee that this beta 0 and this beta are going to be exactly the same. And this is where we start figuring out how to actually estimate this model. We're going to use that beta t at some point is going to be equal to the previous beta that I'm going to update it using this approach. So all of this is part or is how we use to estimate a nonlinear model. We start with a guess, we estimate the derivative and the Hessian, and we start updating everything to see if my first guess was correct. If it's not, I'm going to update it, I'm going to get closer, so on and so forth. Now, what is telling you is the following: is in order to solve this system of equations, nonlinear functions, you need to use a recursive system. Recursive because of this part. I'm always trying to update the information with my previous guess. So that the betas are updated until there is no longer a change. So once I find a solution, the betas do not change anymore. That's what I'm going to assume to be the betas of my model. This is an iterative process that is also known as the Newton-Raphson approach to solve nonlinear equations, assuming that there is a solution that exists. So how does this work? What this is telling you is that you're going to change beta in the direction that should minimize the sum of the square residuals. Now, so it should minimize because it's not really trying to get you to the minimum value, but rather it's trying to get you to the platter that is closer to the point that you are. And that direction is going to be given by the function g. Now, how to get to that point? I'm going to get that point by using the fastest route possible based on the Hessian. So I'm going to move in this direction using this and how fast I need to move. And this is one of the most basic, not the most basic, but one of the most basic numerical optimization approaches. So let me tell you now graphically how exactly this is happening. So first of all, this methodology is not really meant to obtain minimums or maximums of a function. What it's trying to do is to give you a beta that makes a function to be equal to 0, to make a flat point or something to be equal to 0. You get me? So let's assume that if we want to look, how do we know that a function has reached a flat point?
Take derivatives are equal to 0.
So let's assume then that I'm going to look at a function where this is my first derivative. Now, what the Newton-Raphson approach, this approach is trying to tell you is the following. It's start with some guess, any guess on your beta, but try to make the guess rather good. I do not know what the solution, so let's start with a reasonable guess and let's say, let's start with my beta 0 to be this point. So that's what I start over here. My beta 0 is equal to that point. In what direction should I move? According to this, I know that I'm farther from 0, so I can evaluate it, and I'm not at 0. But I know that this f prime is equal to my g, so I know that I can move in this direction to find a point that is going to be closer to 0. So I just get from here, I elongate that function, and I update my guess. From here, I move here. I know it's also wrong, so let's see, beta 0, this is going to be beta 1. In this case, might work. Beta 3. This is a little bit flatter, so I can move, let's say here. Beta 4, still not there, so I can go back again, take the first derivative, move again over here. Beta 5, and I find solution. This is what this is trying to do. By looking at the gradient to figure out how far to go, and the Hessian, although it's not explicit as explicit here, you have to figure out if I should go up or down to get to the solution. So let me actually go with a small example that I would suggest you to replicate on your own at some point, into how to solve, how to find the minimum of this function. This is going to be a quartic function. So it's a very complicated function, and let's say I'm asking you to find the solution. How would we do it? Step 1 would be to find the gradient. You have to see how far it's going to, or what's the derivative at any point of x. Finding the derivative is easy. I derive respect to x, and I have 4x cubed, 36x plus 15. I also need the Hessian. The Hessian is going to be the derivative of this respect to x, which is 12 times x minus 36.
I think it should be 12x squared.
Yes. X squared. And I think that's what I have here. Thank you.
Yeah.
At least I did write correctly right here. So this should be 12x squared minus 36. And finally, we need to define the solution. The solution is going to be given by updating any guess I have minus the gradient divided by the Hessian. For the first derivative divided by the second derivative. Now I'm going to do this in Mata just because Mata is much quicker for these kind of exercises. And the first thing that I do is just write a function that takes as argument x, the point of guess, and which degree of the function I'm trying to estimate. There are three degrees. Either I'm using this one, the first grade or the first derivative, or the second derivative. And it's going to just return that value to me. All good so far? Okay, so now I'm going to start with 3 different guesses. I do not know which one will give me the right result. So I'm just going to start with 3 guesses. My 3 guesses are going to be -2, 2, and 0. So for this, I will start that my xt, I'm writing on this vector is going to have information for the value of x, the derivative, and the Hessian. So I'm going to apply this to this function that is trying to do the transformation. So I'm going to update in x using the derivative divided by the second derivative, and then just plugging it into my matrix to just see how that's evolving. So I do all of that, and then I see what's going on. So for the first model, I start with a guess of -2. My derivative says -86. And my Hessian says 55. So this is -86. It's telling me to move in that direction. So I go even further to -6. 99, I went too far probably. So I need to go back again to the direction. I go back, and I convert it around 3.19, which has This one is the xt. Oh yeah, the first value is the actual value of the function y, and the second one is the derivative. So according to this, the minimum value that I can get using this function is minus 127, and the gradient at that point is almost 0. It's not exactly 0 because I didn't want to go through all the possible derivatives, but it's as good as 0. What would happen if I use 2 instead? Okay, so I start on the other direction. I go a little too high. I converge even better to something that is flat. But my solution is not as deep as the previous one. It's not as low as the previous one. What if I start with 0? With 0, I start with this number, it gives me 4, and then it converts very quickly to 0.42, but the value is actually positive. So what's going on here? Any guesses? There are, because it's a quartic function, there are at least 3 flat points. And because I'm using 3 different starting points, I'm getting to those different solutions. So I'm either getting here, here, or here. Which means that, unfortunately, nonlinear relations are going to be very sensitive to your starting values, to your official guesses, your initial guesses. Sometimes it might give you the right solution, the overall global. Sometimes it might not. It might give you the local maxima or just a local minimum. This is what we should aim to get, but this way we might end up getting.
What are all the columns in the previous equations?
So the first one is the value of x.
Sorry, the colon in your, up above an actual code.
This?
Yeah, or like in the if statements up there.
Let me go step by step. You might be a little more familiar because this follows a little bit closer to what Python does. This is programming in Mata.
Oh, okay.
And it's within Stata. So you first type Mata and this into a different environment. It's easier if you copy all of this into a loop file though, because Stata doesn't really have a more friendly environment to do programming on the command line. You always need to do what you like. So what I'm saying is, first, create a function. And I'm calling this function the FGH for F, that will give me this, G, that will give me the gradient, and H, that will give me the H. So this is going to receive 2 parameters. One is the value of x. And the second one is what degree I'm going to estimate this for. So the degrees could be 0, which again is the official one, F. 1, the first derivative, which will be the gradient, and 2, which will be the Hessian. So I'm saying if I'm requesting to get the official data, I just need to estimate y to be equal to the constant that I started with. If is equal to 1, then it's the first derivative. This. If is equal to 2 is the second derivative. And this is telling, after you do all of this, just return y.
Yeah, so what, so like where it says negative x to the 4th power.
The dots.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is because Stata has this very convenient function to do operations with columns. Let's say, well, I have to write it over here. Let's say you have a column of x. You have a vector of x that has the values 1, 2, 3, and you want to have another function. I'm going to call it a square that is equal to 1 square, 2 square, 3 square.
Okay.
There are 2 ways to do that. You will be doing this in Stata, you will have to say x on the position 1, 1, or x squared on the position 1, 1 is going to be equal to x 1, 1 squared. And you have to do this for every single element.
Okay.
What this column is doing is saying, I want that all the elements of x to be applied this function, the squared. So what is going to go is into the function, and for every element, either row or column, and it's going to apply the same function.
Okay, it's kind of like the hashtags when you're working with categorical like interactions where you take every. I guess,
Something like that on that principle, that you want to apply the same transformation for all your data.
Yeah, okay.
But that's what is that. It uses that information for any option or any element of your matrix.
Because
That was
it's
the
a matrix, not a, okay.
Just because I was doing it here, I wanted to do 3 examples at the same time and make it as a matrix. Otherwise, if this would be just a scalar, I wouldn't need those.
Okay, that makes sense, thank you.
Yes, then this is just a for function that literally says for I starting in value 1 up to value 8, add 1 every time, and it stops when you get to this to be true. Or while this is true, continue going until that reaches. And the last part is just xt. I start with these values. This just says concatenated, putting the information below, below, and below. Okay, so in this particular case, there are 3 solutions, and that's why, depending on the initial values, you're going to have a different solution. Now, we can use the same principles and now solve for a nonlinear least square. So I'm going to include this for a very specific one, and relatively easy. That is beta 0 plus beta 1 times x2 to the power of beta 2 plus an error. Because all of this is my nonlinear function. So first I need to identify my pseudo-regressors. The pseudo-regressors are the derivatives of the function h respect to the parameter beta. So first pseudo-regressor is derivative of this respect to beta 0, which is just the constant 1. The second derivative is just this derivative beta 1 is x to beta 2. The third one is respect to beta 2, which is equal to beta 1 times x beta 2 times log of beta 2. So these are my pseudo-regressors. Now I can apply my beta function. This is how I'm going to update it every time. And I'm going to also need my errors, just to see if I'm getting to the right solution. I'm minimizing the errors. Now, a couple of things here. When these are equal, we can assume that this is the solution. And this part becomes something similar to what we observed for the OLS. For OLS, we were saying that the beta hat is equal to the true beta plus x transpose x, x transpose error, right? So the values of the betas depend on this component. And based on this, I can construct all of the standard errors that we discussed. HE1, HE2, HE3, cluster, bus, blah, 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 blah. Now, for nonlinear regressions, this component over here has basically the same structure. So I can also use it to construct my variances of the betas. Which means, once again, everything that you have learned to estimate the beta of the standard errors can also be applied now for the cases of nonlinear least squares. So you can just sandwich like regular OLS. Okay, so you want to see how this works? We can go with the log example. I would recommend you to go through that and see you understand what is happening. But at the end, I'm just applying the same approach that I did before to give me the right solutions plus the variance covariance matrix. But I'm going to give you instead the short example using stata comments. If you would like to estimate a model in stata using nonlinear least squares, you can do that using the function NL. NL stands for nonlinear function. How do you use it? You start with NL. In parentheses, you're going to type in the function that you think is driving your model. So I would say NL Y between, how do you call this? Brackets, curly brackets. Between braces, you have to include all the parameters that need to be estimated. So between braces, beta 0, beta 1, x, beta 2, close parentheses. Now, what you see here is that I'm also adding something that says equal to 1, equal to 1, and equal to 1, right? What I'm using there is I'm telling stata to start with those as my first guesses on the data. Because by default, the stata will assume that the first guess for all the vectors is going to be equal to 0. But if it's equal to 0, if this is equal to 0, this is equal to 1, and it cannot identify any changes from the function. But if I start with 1, then it can identify some changes on the function. Okay, so I do this. It provides you with some idea on how the residuals are changing. And the output will be basically the same as you had before. With the difference that what you're going to have here is not your coefficients anymore, or it's not the variables anymore, but are only the names of the coefficients. So you have beta 0, that in my model was the constant, beta 1, that is the first parameter, and beta 2, that is the exponential parameter. Other than that, the interpretation is the same, except, of course, the interpretation will depend on what exactly is what you're trying to do. What I mean is that beta 0 still has almost the same interpretation as before, meaning it's what is the expected outcome when everything else is equal to 0. When x is 0, this disappears. If there will be other x's, they probably will disappear. The only thing that is left is beta 0. So beta 0 is the expected value of y when x is equal to 0. What about the others one? The other ones? How can you interpret these other two conditions? Will depend on your question. For example, let's say that instead of estimating this model, I estimate a model that is NL Y beta 0 times K beta 1 L then using actual static syntax is 2 beta 1 L 2 I'm 1 minus. This is the estimation of a Coe-Douglas function, assuming that the error is linear. How do you interpret the coefficients? What is this beta 0? Remember what I'm trying to do. With alpha is this beta 0. So how do you interpret the A? Is the technology, right? At least that's how I learned. So this is your technology. This is the share of the production that belongs to capital, and this is what belongs to labor. So in this model, beta 1 will be interpreted the same way that your alpha will be interpreted. Your beta 0 will be interpreted the same way that A0 will be interpreted. In the model that I wrote in the blackboard, and that is estimated on the screen, do we have the same interpretation for the coefficients? Probably yes, probably no. Probably what you still would like to estimate is this. What is the marginal impact of X as on Y? And if that's the case, well, you need to do the math. In this case would be, for example, beta 1 times beta 2 X beta 3 minus 1. So now you have a nonlinear function. You can ask Stata to do it for you, or you can estimate it by hand and figure out at which X you want to estimate this for. Now, using this, we could estimate now something that will be closer to a logic, appropriate, Poisson, or other kind of nonlinear models that we saw last semester. Or can you? So let's start with a logic function. The logic function is just a transformation that we do to the outcome such that the predicted values are always between 0 and 1. And it just uses a logistic transformation. So let me use that logistic transformation to express the change on the probability effect of Y. So far, nothing seems different from what you know for the logic model, right? Except that for this version, I have an error that is adding to the function. And because of that, this is not a logic model, but it's something that will be almost similar to it. So let me apply this model to using NL. And for this, I'm going to use the Oaxaca dataset, where my intention would be to estimate the probability that somebody is willing to work. So somebody is working, the level for participation is equal to a logistic function, which is a summary for all of these, with my constant beta 0 plus beta 1 colon, because when I use colon, I can apply other variables. So I don't need to type 1 for each one of them. This makes things easier for Stata because he knows, or Stata knows, that when you have a model like this, the derivatives are very easy to estimate. Since it only needs to take the derivative with respect to beta 1, given that the derivative of beta 1 with respect to female is just the constant. So I do this and gives me this result. Beta 0, 3.43, female minus 3.05, etc., etc. Now, just like before, this model cannot be interpreted directly because those coefficients are only giving you the direction on how it's going to affect the probability. If you would like to estimate the probability using this, you will have to use some transformation, and I would encourage you to figure out how to get those marginal effects using NL. Shortcut or quick solution for this is you usually tell here what values are being used in the model. I think is a function bar, and you tell that you're going to include female, age, and education, and then you can use what is this? Margins to estimate those marginal effects. If you want an example, my paper on F-able function, when I explain how this function works, tells you exactly how this works. Now the question is, does this provide you something similar to the logistic regression? Well, if I estimate the logic function with the official command, it gives me something like this, which is very similar to these results, but not exactly the same. And it has at least one reason why it's not exactly the same. Well, two reasons why it's not exactly the same. Even though this function now guarantees that my predicted values will be between 0 and 1, as we would like to, instead of a linear probability, or instead of a linear probability model, we're still assuming that the errors are almost elastic, because the errors are outside and I'm not doing anything to those errors. I can correct for elasticity by using weighted least squares, which I'm going to talk about next class. I can also use robust standard errors, etc., to correct or at least account for the standard errors or for the possible heteroscedasticity in this model. But because I'm not, these coefficients are not correcting for heteroscedasticity, and that's why they are different from what the logic model is providing. Okay, now let's stop there. Next week we're going to talk about generalized linear model and the iterative reweighted least square, not iterative. So take that in out of there. All right. So next week we're going to finish maximum likelihood or iterative reweighted least squares, maximum likelihood, and the week after that we start with the causal effect models. The only other thing is, so 2 weeks, first person presenting will be Sham. She's going to present in the last half hour of the class. Oh, yes,
We have spring break even too.
that's only Monday and Tuesday.
Oh, really?
I have no idea.
That's all we.
I'll be in Chicago.
Well, if it's a holiday, so sad.
The next,
So sad.
Who likes holidays?
Well, it's spring break, it's not all day.
Exactly, so you can come. I'm kidding. Okay, so not in 2 weeks, but so this works perfect. We finish the first half right before the spring break, and then we start with the causal effect models. Now, on that regard, for that first class, I want you to provide me with some of the introduction on your papers. Introduction and what papers you're planning to use as part of your literature review. It doesn't have to be a comprehensive, but at least a couple of pages where you say, this is what I'm going to write because it's important because of this and this. I'm planning to use this approach, or I'm going to do this replication using that their data, but I'm trying to expand it in this way. And these are a couple of the papers that have also do something similar, or that I'm going to use as an alternative approach on measuring these, or they suggest to do something different. So a little bit of the literature review plus an introduction of your paper. So you have 3 weeks for that. Therefore, I won't feel as bad that we're going to be taking a vacation. Okie dokie? Okie dokie? Any questions?
We're still doing the paragraph thing next week.
No, I already showed you the solution, but I might prepare a homework that will include a little bit of the discussion between Qs and UQs. So if I have enough time, you will have a homework next week. But should be much shorter than this one, hopefully.
is,
Yes.
okay, so for the presentations, are we planning on like each section is 1 day, like 1 week? So like for potential outcomes and causal models.
Yes, I'm gonna have, or going to do my best to do 1 class per method. Otherwise, we won't finish all of them.
Okay, so we would have, on the first week back, we would have 4 presentations.
4, 1 presentation.
Okay.
Yes, it's 1 per topic.
Oh, and this is the break. Got it. Okay. Perfect. Okay.
All right.
We're not, you just want like, we're not gonna like present our starts to our projects in class.
No, I'm just going for the class. It's going to be your final project. You're going to present in class your ideas, all of that. So another half an hour to present your work. But for 2 weeks from now, I want to start having what you're going to be writing on. So your introduction, some of the literature, motivation, and what you're gonna do. Okie dokie. All righty. Thank you. And let's